Hello, everyone. Welcome to the world's most fantastic podcast, most cosmic irradiated podcast. It's Uncanny Tracks, covers Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run. I am Bob in Cascadia. That is Matt in the Southland. Matt, how are you doing tonight?
I don't know, Bob. I've just taken a trip to 4 different cities.
You're becoming an urban tourist in this edition. So, for our listeners, we're talking about the second volume of Hickman's FF run. It goes from issue 575 to issue 578, just 4 issues. The overarching story is called Prime Elements. So, any other lead-off thoughts about your urban tourism, Matt?
Well, it's a fun little adventure, Bob. Very different from X-Men.
Also, in some ways, a little bit of an introduction to the Fantastic Four, quote, universe, unquote. I mean, we see 4 very different dimensions of antagonist or places that the FF encounter very often.
You're taking a field trip to see what the Fantastic Four is all about.
Yeah, as the FF continues to accumulate kids, this will have a lot more field trip energy as that keeps going.
All right, Bob, so let's break down these issues.
All right, our first issue is number 575, Abandoned City of the High Evolutionary, Prime Elements Part 1. Matt, what goes on in this issue?
Mole Man calls upon the Fantastic Four to help him stop the abandoned city of the High Evolutionary's effect on his moloid subjects.
Matt, what are your memories of the Mole Man?
All I really remember about the Mole Man is from the cartoons. It's about it. Then it's really weird because the Pixar animated movie, The Incredibles, is essentially a Fantastic Four movie. And
Yes.
at the end of that film, a character comes out that's the villain. So he calls himself the Underdweller and looks almost identical to Mole Man.
Is it weird, or is it Pixar committing to the pastiche?
It's Pixar committing.
Disney owned Pixar but didn't own Marvel at that point?
Yeah.
Okay. Were you appropriately grossed out when we've talked about the FF just picking up children? So we have a moloid, and they just pop the head off of the moloid. The other moloids do because the head survives. Was that gross for you?
Yeah, I didn't know they work that way. It's very, very creepy.
Yeah. And then I guess last kind of orientation question. Are you familiar with the High Evolutionary?
Much more now thanks to the X-Men animated series coverage, because there was an episode where we're introduced to the High Evolutionaries.
Initially, when you said this, I was like, he wasn't on the X-Men the animated series, and I'm going to have to go figure out what you're talking about, and I'm going to have to explain the High Evolutionary, who I don't have a great understanding of. But then, Matt, I went back and looked, and no, you were right. I was wrong. The High Evolutionary was in the second part of the Savage Land two-parter. So I'm the moron. I'm wrong. I'm the one who apparently doesn't know the High Evolutionary. Matt, you should take a victory lap.
That's really all I know about the High Evolutionary. Oh, and his action figures currently are warming the pegs at Ollie's.
He's a dude who wants to evolve things. That's pretty much his deal. So he hangs out at Mount Wundagore a lot. I don't have much else to say about him. I do really enjoy this background gag in Dale Eaglesham's art in this issue, where Franklin and Val are taking care of the severed but still speaking head of the moloid. Like they get it like a plate that floats around, and they put a bubble on top of the plate. It's very cute.
All right, so are they treating it more like a pet or a toy?
I would say they're treating it more like a friend, Matt.
All right, teach his own, Bob.
I feel like you're going to regret that comment as we go further, and the children become, in some ways, very important parts of this run, and in some ways not very well developed, which is one of the interesting things about this run.
But does the head continue to travel with them?
Yes.
I guess we'll get to see, or if I'm right in my assumption that they're treating it like a pet.
I think they're going to treat it like a friend. And if I recall, in the future Foundation run right after this, by Fraction, the moloids get more personality in that, if I recall correctly.
Oh, okay.
So, Matt, another visual here that was pretty striking is the dead Galactus from the future that Reed has buried underground, that the FF and the Mole Man kind of pass as they're heading towards the city of the High Evolutionary. That's from the same Mark Miller and Brian Hitch run, and it's involved with New Earth that we talked about last time. And again, we're really hitting the limits of Bob's knowledge this episode, because I don't know that much about the High Evolutionary, and I haven't read that Miller run of FF, and I'm probably not going to. So yeah, it's a dead Galactus from the future. That's all I got.
That was definitely one of the cooler visuals in this volume, seeing the dead Galactus laying there, and you're just not used to seeing him dead.
One thing I thought was kind of interesting in this issue, Matt, have you noticed that Jonathan Hickman likes to write about monarchs.
That's kind of his thing, isn't it?
Maybe to put it another way, because the Marvel Universe is a fantasy that was mostly thought up of in the 1960s, it's going off a lot of old science fiction and fantasy tropes where everybody's a king or something, right?
Right.
And so Hickman, in some way, and we'll definitely see this a lot more as like Namor and Black Panther become more important in this run, but Hickman really does like try to write monarchs with the pomposity and grandiosity and maybe reactionary political views that monarchs usually have. We see that with the Mole Man here. And so the Mole Man is arguing with Ben that he doesn't want his moloids to be evolved by the High Evolutionaries' technology. And it's creepy and it's very much, oh, they're my children, I keep them safe vibe. But it is also fascinating that the Mole Man does seem to have a point, because the evolved moloids don't seem happy, and they do turn pretty brutally eugenicist after they evolve, with leaving the children out of the city when they don't manifest the evolution.
Bob, more power, more problems.
The Hickman run is very focused on Reed, but you do have to give this props to this issue for Johnny, Sue, and Ben all having good stuff to do. Johnny's blasting through the earth, Sue's using her fields to protect the ship, and Ben has the heroic moment where he jumps underneath the city of the High Evolutionary to save what remains of the abandoned, unevolved Moloid children.
That was great, and the art here is fantastic. Just really cool to see all their powers being used in that way, and not in the typical Johnny shot fire at something.
We, I think, both incline more to talk about writing than art, but we should underline again, Dale Eaglesham's doing the art on these 4 issues, and he's doing a hell of a job. Speaking of art, Matt, did you have any thoughts on Ben's temporarily evolved monkey look from him?
Did it make him smarter, or was it just meant to be visually entertaining? I didn't really notice any difference in his personality.
I didn't notice any difference in the personality either. I think it was meant to be
a visual gag.
And it's funny because when it first happened, did you think he was like going to be like stuck like that for 5 issues or something?
I kind of did, yeah. I thought this is what they're going to go for, and now he's going to have to deal with this. Is going to be Ben Grimm's whole arc here, and that dealing with being evolved. But it went away after the issue, so I think we're good.
It's funny, given how casual Ben is about the whole thing. Yeah. Well, the man has spent 575 issues, more or less, as a rock monster. So, what's a slightly different form of being a rock monster, I suppose, right? He's pretty cool about it, especially if he got it just trying to save kids. I think he's fine with that. And it's also kind of funny how chill Reed is about it. He's like, yeah, it's only going to last 90 minutes or whatever.
It's just a normal thing. Just evolve temporarily.
A lot of times people do like to do Thing Wolverine team-ups. I do think those characters do have a similar vibe. The most awful things can happen to them, and they're blasé about it.
Yeah, they've been around long enough.
And between the Thing's cosmic evolutions and between Wolverine's healing factor, they're not that worried about anything.
Right.
All right, Matt. So maybe the most exciting thing to debut in terms of Hickman ticks, we have the return of Hickman text pieces for these 4 issues. Were you stoked that you had to read a page instead of look at the art and read a page?
This is an obvious area where Hickman has improved tremendously. The text pieces here are more like bullet points of stuff that you couldn't fit into the issue. Whereas I feel like the ones in X-Men, they're usually, if you're reading a letter to someone, or you're reading the specific blueprint or plans for something coming up, or there's diagram.
More of a graphic design, or like you say, a diagram.
Whereas here, it's just some bullet points, and a lot of it is stuff that you're going to have to imagine happen between the pages. He's just telling you certain things that they didn't want to have to go through the trouble of, or really weren't worth drawing out or showing in the visual piece of a comic. That's what I got from these. Did he start doing these here, or was he doing them before in something else?
These are all good questions. To answer one that's kind of implicit in what you said, I can't remember what the future trajectory of text pieces is in this run. I can't remember if they're a regular thing here on out, or if it's just something he occasionally comes back to. I'm also not sure if they get more visual as the run goes, or if they stay more text-oriented. So that would be the answer to one of your questions you raised.
You don't know, like, when did he actually start doing this, though, like adding these text elements?
He's been doing that since the beginning. His first comic from Image is called The Nightly News. It's very text-based, or rather, it's not just text-based. It has a lot of visuals and illustrations, as I remember. The Nightly News is not my favorite comic, but it is an interesting one that's worth reading. That's always been one of Hickman's gimmicks. And also, definitely, so the Nightly News is his first comic for Image, and then there's a second comic, the name of which is escaping me, but it's about time travel. In both of those, Hickman does the art too, and he does some drawing, but it's a lot of computer images being manipulated. I know those first two are not to everybody's taste. I think it's
Pax Romana.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, it's Pax Romana. And for a while, there was talk of a Sci-Fi Network series of Pax Romana, but it never came to pass, as far as I'm aware. After that, for stuff like Transhuman and Red Mass from Mars and Red Wing, which were his other early miniseries for Image, I think he gets other artists for those. But yeah, he uses diagrams, visuals, text pieces, and Hickman, I think, was a graphic designer before he was a comics writer.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I feel like this is like bare bones, though, this part, compared to what he did in X-Men.
Well, I will defend it a little bit here because I do appreciate the way it like expands the scope of these issues. I find that a pretty useful thing, and I wish more comics would do stuff like that more often. But to one other aspect of your question, this is his second big Marvel run. His first big Marvel run is Secret Warriors, which is a book about superheroes working for Nick Fury. It's pretty good. It's not my favorite or anything, but it's pretty good. Maybe we could talk about it somewhere far down the line. I want to say that there were text pieces in it, but I can't say that definitively. I don't actually remember. So maybe this is the first time he's doing it at Marvel. It's definitely not the first time he's doing it in general, but maybe it's the first time he's doing it at Marvel.
It's actually one of the things I look forward to in the X-Men comics. So it's a really cool concept.
To move on to issue number 576, Matt, it's called Old Kings of Atlantis. Do you want to give our listeners the plot of Old Kings of Atlantis?
So the Fantastic Four go to protect an Antarctic research station they sponsor from AIM and discover the three kings of Old Atlantis under the ice.
I do really like when FF stories focus on them being explorers or them dealing with Star Trek-like plots. It makes them stand out more, and this has been the problem that all the Fantastic Four movies have run into. They can come across as just another generic superhero team, but if you're doing more exploration-based stories or more like Star Trek-type stories, the uniqueness of the team stands out a lot better.
This is where I really felt the uniqueness of Fantastic Four as compared to X-Men in this issue. This is the one. This is the issue I'm like, oh, okay, that could be different. I felt it a little with the birthday issue last volume. Just because of the whole family aspect and the little kids and everything. Like, that's a whole different dynamic to me than I'm used to seeing X-Men. But here, they're going on an exploration. The X-Men usually don't do that. They're usually, they're fighting something or they're going from point A to point B. They're not exploring, with the exception of the recent desert thing, but even that's...
It's because they're exiled there.
There's usually them being pushed somewhere, whereas opposed this is them actually exploring something to learn.
That would be the other theme or the other topic that makes the FF stand out is there's family elements to like teams like the Avengers and X-Men, but the FF, the entire team is a family. You were saying last week with the birthday issue, you can explore that, and that also gives them some distinctiveness from X-Men, Avengers, and what have you. So, Matt, did the old Fantastic Four bits of Johnny pranking Ben, I guess in this case it's him tipping Ben's chair, did that make you laugh? And likewise, did him having a swimsuit on in Antarctica, did that make you laugh?
Yeah, I'm glad that after 60 years, this is still funny. Because they've done these gags before. This isn't anything new. We've seen Johnny in a swimsuit in the cold. I know I have at some point.
Oh, you have? Okay. It didn't ring a bell for me, but as we've established, I forget stuff.
Ben just joking around. That's normal. That's the usual.
The Ben and Johnny prank war has been there almost, not since the beginning, but since very close to the beginning. Yeah. All right, Matt, did you enjoy? We have nearly 12 silent underwater pages in this issue, and especially since the issue felt pretty talky at the start, even talkier than a normal Hickman comic, I thought it was an interesting contrast going from that talkiness to the silent underwater stuff.
It really made me feel like I was taking a journey, because the whole first part of the issue is Invisible Woman explaining what they need to do, and then there's this, okay, now we're going to go do it. So there's not a lot of talking in the actual piece where they're exploring underwater and getting to where they need to be.
That's the kind of thing that a lot of these issues fall into in this collection, where you'll have Sue or Reed or Val explain a scenario while Johnny and Ben only half pay attention. That's a pretty familiar formula. Matt, in this issue, they're talking about Namor's Atlantis being destroyed. We're having old Atlantis under the Antarctic, but Namor's Atlantis was destroyed in a 2007 Submariner comic.
That detail, while I know it was stated in the comic book, not knowing that threw me off a little bit.
I can feel that, but on the other hand, Matt, don't read that Submariner mini.
I'm not planning on it.
Do you want to run down who the three old kings of Atlantis represent?
We've got the fish workers, we've got the eels, and we have the crabs, and each one of them is a different caste.
The fish are a laboring caste, the eel a bureaucratic or administrative caste, and the crab a warrior caste.
So, interesting. There's a whole new world we've been introduced to here, Bob.
It does have a little bit of a Disney movie vibe to it, doesn't it? Like we said, Hickman does enjoy exploring monarchs and caste systems and things like that in his work. So it is pretty funny that Sue has to, in effect, become the queen of the humans to speak to the three old kings in a way and on terms that they will understand. It does recall Storm becoming the queen of the solar system after the mutants terraform Mars into Araco, and Storm starts regularly talking as a representative of both humans and mutants to the various galactic monarchs.
I'm starting to see some trends and some patterns in Hickman's writing.
Sue says she has to become humanity's spokesperson, and I could see three reasons for that. One, she's the only member of the FF who's both intelligent and sociable. Then the second would be, you can imagine Namor will not be pleased with this, and he always has had a special regard for Sue, so she might be the only one who can pacify Namor about this threat to his rule. Or you could also see it a little bit. The humans need to tweak and acclimate these old Sea Kings to women having public roles. They don't say, but you get the feeling the Sea Kings might be a little misogynist.
I went with the first one in my interpretation, is that she knew that Reed wouldn't be able to handle that. Johnny and the Thing for sure couldn't be in that role. So she took it on herself. Then the whole Namor thing as well.
I'm just saying, introducing the concept of gender equality to the old fish, crab, and eel people is a good strategy.
And then you find out they're asexual.
Curses. Issue number 576, it's Universal Inhumans. Do you want to run us through the plot of Universal Inhumans?
The Fantastic Four return to the blue area of the moon to discover that the Kree haven't just made Inhumans through genetic experimentation, but in Centurions, Ibadoon, and Chameleons, and Indie Wraiths.
Hickman never uses these terms. He just calls them like the Universal Inhumans. But to me, it's just right there. If the humans are Inhumans, shouldn't the Centaurians be in Centaurians and the Badoon be in Badoon? Speaking of somebody taking joy for something, I really do enjoy Ben's enjoyment about getting to pilot a rocket back into space. That's a nice little moment.
It's almost like they redid the visual of them taking off in the original Fantastic Four when they were humans going into space, but here they were already in their outfits.
I think that's a pretty common reference point across Fantastic Four runs. Matt, how familiar are you with the Inhumans? I felt like the issue does a decent job describing their origin from Kree genetic manipulation.
So they were exposed to the Terrigen mist, is that correct?
Yes, but it's the Kree manipulated some human genetics a long time ago. And then when those manipulated humans or some of their descendants come into contact with the Terrigen mist is when the Inhumanness is activated. Does that make sense?
Kind of like the Tar in Young Justice.
It is interesting that, unless I'm forgetting something, this issue really stresses the Kree genetic manipulation, which was a known thing in the comics already, but it does not stress the Terrigen mist as much. How familiar are you with the Kree and the AI that rules them, the Supreme Intelligence, or the Supremor, as he's sometimes called?
I know all about the Kree because they were in the MCU all over the place.
The next species, Matt, are you familiar with the Centaurians?
Yondu, that's the only one I know.
That's the only one I know, too. So, yeah,
blue.
tall blue guy, controls an arrow through whistling. Had you ever heard of the Badoon?
I don't have a clue.
I'm not super familiar with them, but they show up as a minor enemy alien species a lot of Marvel Cosmic Comics. The only thing I've read that ever really has gone deep into them is have you didn't read like the first modern Guardians of the Galaxy comics, the ones from around like 2007 that had the team be in its more or less in its movie configuration? You never read those?
No, I didn't read any of those.
On the one hand, they're pretty good. On the other hand, they're basically all tie-ins to larger Marvel Cosmic crossovers, which makes them a little difficult to read.
Okay.
Also, they have the Office gimmick of like having characters like talk to a documentarian. It does that, but in a comic, and it's not great.
Okay.
But anyway, in that series, the Badoon are prophesize that they're going to become one of the major empires in our local group of galaxies in the future. That's the Badoon. I don't know much else about them. And then, Matt, we talked about the Chimelians last week. Do you remember who the Chimelians are?
Yeah, I remember from the conversation we had about the Power Pack. They're the horse aliens, space horses.
Who empower the Power Pack. Then, if I say the Dire Wraiths, you're probably not going to remember them. But do you remember an evil alien species that appeared in some X-Men reprints we had as a kid, where Mohawk Storm gets shot by Forge's anti-mutant gun? Do you remember that?
I vaguely remember that comic, yes, but the Dire Wraiths, like I can't picture what they look like, and I keep thinking of Paw Wraiths from Deep Space Nine.
They're shadowy figures they're not a main thing, but they're in those few X-Men comics around, like Storm losing her powers. It's been established that they're genetic offshoots of the Skrulls, that they're shapeshifters and they've been manipulated to separate from the Skrull. Do you know Rom Space Knight?
No, not a clue.
He wasn't around when we were reading, but he was like a toy that Marvel got the license to publish in the 80s. And so they did a big like 75 issue series that a lot of people remember very fondly. And the Dire Wraiths are the villains in that Rom Space Knight series. And it's one of those things where Marvel doesn't usually have the rights to Rom, but they have the rights to the Dire Wraiths and the other Space Knights. And so Rom hasn't appeared much in Marvel Comics since, but the Dire Wraiths and the Space Knights have.
I Googled Rom Space Knight. I recognize the robot-looking dude. He was a toy. I remember that.
You do recognize him.
From a million years ago. Old school 70s toy.
I said 80s, but probably late 70s, early 80s would be more accurate. Marvel does have the rights to Rom back, and they're doing reprints now, and maybe they'll bring him back into the universe in a limited way. Although maybe not, because they'll just lose the rights again at some point, you know.
8-part Disney miniseries.
Just a general observation about these 3 issues. I like how over the course of them, each one becomes less and less a story.
Yeah. It's like it reminds me of X-Men. Not as easy to follow, but it's not bad. It's just harder to figure out exactly what's going on. It makes you think more than what I'm used to with reading comics.
Any other remarks about the Universal Inhumans?
No, I've got nothing else for this one. But we do have our third city, because we've already covered 2 cities now. We're at our third.
We're getting close, because remember, Adult Franklin's prophecy to Valeria was a war of 4 cities, right?
Yep. Let's talk about that fourth city, Bob.
Issue number 577, Cult of the Negative Zone. Matt, what's the plot of Cult of the Negative Zone?
So Johnny's date goes wrong, and he rashly dives into the negative zone, only to discover the prophesized 4th city.
Yeah, I really love that Johnny is basically at a Lovecraftian cult nightclub. It's a club of people who worship, I think, Annihilus and worship the Negative Zone, and Johnny just doesn't notice at all.
Walk up in the club, and there's a dude up on stage with a big minus sign tattooed on his forehead with a big minus sign behind him. Don't know what's going on here.
Matt, I feel pretty confident in saying you remember the Annihilus and Blastar action figures, right?
That's exactly what I remember. I don't know who they are as characters, but I remember them as action figures because I feel like the Fantastic Four animated series, were these characters actually on that show, or are they just pumping out action figures of these characters?
I'm pretty sure they were, but I could be wrong. But I would say I'm like 75% sure they were.
Yeah, Annihilus had like wings and looked like a green insect creature, and Blastar was a big gray monkey looking man.
They're both highly associated with the Negative Zone, which is basically the Fantastic Four's version of the Phantom Zone, but less of, although it tends to even be more psychedelic than the Phantom Zone. The Phantom Zone in Superman comics just tends to be like gray and dour, whereas people tend to illustrate the Negative Zone with a lot more kind of like psychedelic black light art. There are indigenous creatures to the negative zone, which is not as common in the Phantom Zone. Although, if I'm remembering right, it's maybe Annihilus is indigenous to the zone, while Blastar comes into it and rules part of it later. But maybe I have that mixed up.
Okay. Are these tied in any way to Mr. Negative?
I have not much familiarity with Mr. Negative because I've never played the game and I've never read, because he, as far as I know, he doesn't show up till the Dan Slott comic run, which is around this time. So there could be, but I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I think he may have ties to the Negative Zone somehow, but I don't remember off the top of my head.
Maybe it's a source of power for him. That could be cool. Even if he isn't, somebody should make him tied to it.
Let's do it, guys. Let's write that, Bob.
So I really do love in this issue that we have Val debriefing Johnny, the smartest member of the team, talking to the dumbest member of the team. And Val does love her uncle. I just find that super
She has her
charming.
own little iPad with the questions she has to ask. She's like reading on a college level at 3.
Is the Human Torch literate? I mean, that's a serious question. Is he literate? I don't know. We have the War of the Four Cities beginning in this issue as Namor issues a challenge to the Old Kings. Would you like to read Namor's challenge to the Old Kings of Atlantis, Matt?
Who are you to call yourself kings? Who calls himself king that has never felt the sun on his face, that cowers under the ice at the bottom of the world?
We also have the Universal Inhumans begin to attack the city in the negative zone. Did you like how this issue shifts from introducing the Fourth City to starting the War of the Four Cities, or were you frustrated because we aren't really told very much about the city in the negative zone in this issue? We just know it's there and it's bad, and Johnny saw it.
They didn't do a good job of showing us the Negative Zone city and explaining what it really is.
They will say more about it later, but I also think it's a deliberate strategy of Lovecraftian or the Forbidden City, or the player in the fighting game who has a question mark over him.
I guess we'll learn more as we go on. I felt like we were more introduced to the other 3 than this one. This one we had the least.
Oh, we definitely were. We definitely were. Well, and it does make the point that there's an interesting kind of trade-off in these issues, and I'm not saying this is like a criticism of them. I think it's just generally a trade-off in making comics, in that the first 3 aren't so much stories, they're just introductions to the cities. Yeah. Whereas the fourth one is more of a story, but it has to scrimp on being an introduction to the city. Shall we go ahead and move into our categories, Matt?
Sure, Bob. So, favorite visual. My favorite visual was in the final issue where there's the creature that's coming out of the girl Johnny meets at the club. That was insane.
That was very creepy. It gave it a very kind of insectoid Lovecraft feel to the issue.
Literally, she was a skin suit and the bug was taking her off.
Whereas yours was gross and scary, mine is gross and charming, I thought. There's a big panel in the first issue we looked at, 575, where a moloid in the background of the underground is just grilling mushrooms, and then other moloids are riding giant ants. It almost had a Smurf quality to it that I really liked.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
Matt goes with the disturbing, I go with the cute. Matt, what's your favorite line of dialogue?
All right. Favorite line of dialogue, Bob? Wayfinder in the issue with the Inhumans. He goes, "We are his people, a tribe unto ourselves, the Universal Inhumans." And then Big Grim's response is, "Oh boy." The reason I chose that is because it's straight out of Quantum Leap. That's what Sam would always say at the end of the episode.
Interesting.
When he would zap into the new whatever ridiculous situation he was in.
That's funny. That's funny. My favorite line of dialogue was Johnny talking to Herbie. You remember Herbie, Matt?
Oh, yeah, Herbie. Little robot.
Herbie's the robot who replaced Johnny, and I think it was the 70s Fantastic Four cartoon, because they were worried about kids setting themselves on fire. It's Johnny narrating to Herbie the events that led up to Matt's favorite visual, which is to say, Johnny goes to bar, Johnny gets girl, girl turns into bug monster, bug disappears through hole, Johnny never kissed bug, I'm going to call that a win. What's your favorite issue of these 4?
Where there is water and life lived in it, there are giants, which is the Atlantis trip issue, where they go to Atlantis.
That's a fun one. The silent sequence is really cool in that one. I do have to give it up for that one. I'm going to give it to the Negative Zone one, which I feel like was your least favorite, right?
Pretty much, yeah. That's probably my least favorite.
I'm going to give it to the Negative Zone. Partly I'm more comfortable with gaps in narrative. I knew a little bit more about Annihilus and Blastar and the Negative Zone because I did read the Kirby Lee FF run a year or so before I read this one for the first time. It hit for me pretty well. Who's your favorite character of these 4 issues, Matt?
My favorite character I'm going to give to Ben Grimm. He just had a lot of good one-liners, and I like that he saved those Moloid children. That was cool. Good on him.
Yeah. Ben's commitment to saving the kids is always cool. And it's a very Reed-focused series, but Hickman is very good at giving the other three stuff to do. And I also think that's one of the nice things about the FF2 is that even when you add the kids and the alien kids that the FF picks up, it's still a small enough cast as compared to X-Men and Avengers that it's kind of easier to do people more distinctively.
Yeah, with only 4 characters, it's made it a lot
For
easier
my favorite,
to focus on those characters and not have to worry about every background and every background character in the X-Men, every character that has to have some like other subplot going on that I have to keep up with. I felt like the main character of his X-Men stuff was Mr. Sinister, and he's the one I learned the most.
or at least Sinister's a good audience surrogate in a lot
Yes,
of the
yeah,
Krakoa
that's a
era,
better
right,
way to
where he's
put it.
being
Yes, I
catty.
agree.
Well, Matt, we won't do this at any time soon because I don't want to overload you on Hickman, but I would like to do his Avengers run at some point. And my God, 36 Avengers, Matt, 36 Avengers.
God, I can't even imagine that.
All right, he gives you a nice chart of the team, though. That's very helpful.
Well, I mean, in the X-Men books, he has to give you like a summary of each character at the beginning, so
Yeah.
just to remind you, here's who's on this team.
So, oh man. So my favorite character of these 4 issues is Sue. Sue's low key, maybe the best part about the Fantastic Four, just because she's both smart and funny, and so it's always nice to see that combined. Matt, you'll be happy to know, and maybe you'll be offended that I said you'll be happy to know, but at least I'm happy to know that next week we have another short week. It's just 4 issues. If the listeners want to follow along, would be the 3rd original trade of the Hickman run, and it's just issues 579 to 582. This has been Uncanny Treks covering the Hickman. Right now it's the Hickman and Eaglesham Fantastic Four run, but I think Eaglesham drops off at some point, although maybe he doesn't. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, we're covering the Hickman run. I'm Bob in Cascadia. That's Matt in the Southland. Thank you all for listening to Uncanny Treks.
Thanks for listening.